Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 10, The Cabal. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Last week, we saw the most famous act of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. England was bankrupt, and Charles II was forced to mothball the largest ships of the Royal Navy at Chatham dockyards in the Medway. The Dutch, on the orders of Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt, commanded by Michiel de Ruyter, descended on the half-built defences of the Medway. The raid carried off the pride of the Royal Navy, the Royal Charles, and left a dozen other ships burning in shallow water. It was a devastating blow to English pride and firmly hammered home the undeniable truth. England had lost. All that was left was to agree to the peace terms. The Treaty of Breda was signed on the 31st of July 1667, and it's sometimes called the Peace of Breda, because it wasn't just one treaty. It was four. 3 treaties to end hostilities between Charles Stuart and France, Denmark, and the United Provinces, and then a 4th treaty of friendship, commerce, and navigation. That 4th treaty between England and the Dutch was built on with another agreement the following year, and the Peace of Breda became something of a precedent. It would become increasingly common to divide ending a war with resolving the causes of a war. Not every trade dispute needed to end with expensive violence. The agreements with Denmark and France largely returned relations to the status quo ante. Compensation for shipping lost to privateers on both sides was waived, and the colonial situation was restored. This was especially important in the Caribbean, where the entry of France into the war had expanded this front of the conflict. The English colonies of Montserrat and Antigua had been occupied by French troops, while on St. Kitts, an island shared by an English and a French colony, the French colonists defeated their neighbours. For their part, the English had seized the French colony of Cayenne in South America, as well as Acadia in North America. With peace, both sides handed these conquests back. This wasn't the case with the Dutch agreement. Whatever either side occupied on the 20th of May 1667 became theirs. For the Dutch, this meant they kept the colony of Suriname on the South American coast, as well as valuable trading posts in West Africa and the East Indies. For the English, the main spoil of the war was New Netherland, the Dutch claim in North America. If you recall, the English had conquered the capital of New Amsterdam before the official outbreak of the war, and now they officially kept it. Renamed New York in honour of its proprietor, James, Duke of York, the territory of the New Netherlands was vast. It would eventually include the future colonies and future states of Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York, and grow the existing colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts. The Dutch West Indian Company was more than happy with this trade. New Netherland was a large stretch of territory, but besides New Amsterdam, it had only a limited Dutch presence, and, as had just been proven, it was hard to defend. The fur trade, its main valuable export, was far less valuable than the sugar trade, already an established industry for the WIC, and the acquisition of Suriname fitted neatly into this existing trade. Besides territory, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty also waived indemnities for lost shipping. We haven't touched on that much, but Dutch privateers had been much more effective than English privateers had been. The amnesty for hostile acts went all the way back to the Treaty of Westminster, because despite the First Anglo-Dutch War officially ending in 1654, low-level fighting between English and Dutch traders kept on all over the world. But the main source of disagreement, the chief cause of Anglo-Dutch tension in both the First and Second Wars, was the primacy of English ships in English waters and the Navigation Acts. English negotiators won the small concession that Dutch ships would salute English ones when sailing through the Channel or up the British coastline. Dutch negotiators could swallow that small indignity, since it cost nothing but a little pride and some gunpowder. In return, the Dutch gained a huge exception from the Navigation Acts. Their ships were permitted to carry goods from the Holy Roman Empire to and from England. These terms were originally preliminary, but they were confirmed in the subsequent commercial treaty the following year. Charles had also dropped an earlier demand, made when the English position had been much stronger. One of his original terms had been the restoration of his nephew, William of Orange, as stadtholder. But England's defeat and the ascendancy of the statists in Dutch domestic politics meant that this was, for now, out of the question. Despite the humiliation of the raid on the Medway and the bankruptcy of the English crown, the loss of the Second Anglo-Dutch War would not be a significant roadblock for the growing power of England. Nor did victory over their commercial rivals change the fact that, though no one knew it, these were the final years of the Dutch Golden Age. England's defeat was due to running out of road, unable to strike an overwhelming blow before the kingdom's finances ran out. The Royal Navy had outperformed the Dutch States Navy in terms of discipline and marksmanship, and its leaders were as brave and, usually, as competent as their Dutch opponents. The Royal Navy had been defeated at home, not at sea. Johan de Witt was in a much stronger political position than Charles, and the United Provinces were both richer and more capable of raising money. The Dutch spent £11 million on the war. Charles and the Navy Board spent less than half that amount, though not for lack of trying. The end of the war and England's defeat was also the end of the honeymoon period for the restored monarchy. 7 years after Charles had returned in triumph, the political nation, represented by Parliament, was no longer just happy to be involved. Parliament was the same assembly which had been elected in 1661, the so-called Cavalier Parliament. And even with recruiter elections to replace resignations and deaths, all the MPs supported the institution of the Crown. But that didn't mean they blindly supported the decisions and policies of the man wearing it. Here we take another step on the road to political parties, as Anglicans, meaning those following the restored Church of England doctrine in the House of Commons, allied with bishops and Anglican peers in the House of Lords. This country party was more a common alignment on two things: love of the king and the Church of England, and suspicion of practically everything else. Government ministers, privy councillors, officials, and dilettante courtiers were all distrusted as possible Catholics, probably corrupt, and definitely needing a close watch to, as Mark Koszlansky puts it in Monarchy Transformed, prevent government from confusing its interests with the nation. Their love of the king did not mean they loved all his policies, but critics could usually find a minister to blame for them. As the years went on and unpopular decisions were made, Parliament became more and more willing to voice criticism of the government. This was still rarely directed at Charles himself, at least not publicly, but through proxies. Critics of the course of the war with the Dutch used the gentleman and tarpaulins divide to mask their true complaints, as we've mentioned before. But the return of monarchy had brought back a classic: evil councillors, who all the unpopular decisions and mistakes of royal policy could be blamed on. And for most of the 1660s, this role was played by Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon. Clarendon had been a loyal advisor for both Charles and his father, and his reward upon the restoration was elevation to the peerage. But after this rise came a gradual and inevitable fall. Clarendon had had his enemies in the exiled royalist court, and these rivals came back to London with him in 1660. Over the course of the decade, the chief minister of the king lost popularity and influence. Early on, Clarendon had opposed Charles's wish to have the power to exempt people from the Act of Uniformity. He did this not because he was a religious zealot, and in fact he favoured toleration, but because it looked like absolutism. Clarendon was a moderate royalist, and just as he had opposed Charles I's attempts to override the rights of Parliament, he criticised his son for doing the same thing. Clarendon was far from the only one who opposed this particular policy, and the king backed off quickly. But Clarendon's influence declined from here on. His position was weakened by his own ill health and abrasive personality. He was difficult for the other privy councillors to deal with, often insisting he was correct about some policy or other without even discussing it. He repeatedly lectured the king about his mistresses, which was absolutely not appreciated by Charles. Gout and other illnesses often kept him bedbound and away from council, which only reduced his influence further. Meanwhile, his unpopularity only grew. Because Clarendon was known to have once been the chief advisor of both kings, it was taken for granted that he still was. Therefore, every unpopular decision of the government was blamed on him. The selling of Dunkirk, for example. Libels accused Clarendon of being bribed by the French in order to buy the key port at a bargain. The religious policy of the Restoration Parliament, the Clarendon Code, took his name, despite his relative distance from the drafting of these laws and his opposition to them, which made him deeply unpopular with England's many nonconformists. The cost of maintaining Tangiers was also blamed on him, along with, and this is especially groundless, the infertility of Catherine of Braganza, as Queen Catherine had not, and would not, produce a living heir of the king, and Clarendon had been a key advocate for the Portuguese marriage on political grounds. His most passionate critics accused him of somehow knowing that the Portuguese princess was infertile. Why would he want this? Because behind the fancy title, the Earl of Clarendon was just Edward Hyde, the up-jumped commoner, the social climber who had married his daughter to the king's brother James. Never mind that Clarendon had known nothing of their relationship and was furious with his daughter Anne. If Charles remained heirless, then James would become king, and his children with Anne Hyde would be next in line. This, the most salacious rumours said, had clearly been a long con, aimed at securing the thrones of England, Ireland and Scotland for Hyde's grandchildren. As tensions with the Dutch Republic grew over 1663 and 1664, Clarendon was consistently opposed to outright war, for economic reasons more than anything. War was expensive, and a naval war with the Dutch would damage English trade, and fighting fellow Protestants risked being unpopular with the people. But he was losing ground to Lord Arlington and the Duke of Buckingham, both of whom had much more influence over the king. Charles himself favoured a war. A quick victory, complete with the display of captured prize ships sailing up the Thames, would do wonders for the government. When that didn't happen, Clarendon got the blame. As we've seen before, Charles was not his father. He understood that the value of evil counsellors was to load them up with unpopularity and then cut them loose to preserve the status of the crown. He had sacrificed the Earl of Sandwich during the war, and he did so now with Clarendon. As naval historian Nicholas Roger neatly puts it, quote, "Clarendon, who had opposed the war from the first, was ejected from office for losing it." End quote. Threatened with impeachment, Clarendon fled into exile for the second time in his life. Parliament passed an act of banishment, and Charles gave it royal assent. Clarendon would never see England again, dying in 1674 at the age of 65. It was a poor reward for decades of loyalty to the crown, and though Charles followed the political wind, there were those around him, especially in the House of Lords, who judged the king harshly for betraying a loyal servant so quickly and ruthlessly. Mark Kishlansky has a great line on the fall of Clarendon. Quote, "Whatever the Chancellor's faults, he had outlived his age, and was too cautious and too sanctimonious for the new one. He had served the best interests of the kingdom. Callously, his successors would serve the best interests of the king." End quote. Clarendon's fall was satisfying to many in the House of Commons, but he had just been the worst of many. Parliament had raised a fortune for the war. £2.5 million was voted as the clouds of war gathered in 1664, That was the largest single tax Parliament had ever granted. Another £1,250,000 in tax was voted in October 1665. Why, then, had the war effort collapsed for lack of money? How could the Royal Navy be bankrupt just a year later? Surely, the answer was corruption. For once, it actually wasn't. That £2.5 million had been spent at least by the beginning of 1666, and probably sooner considering the Navy's existing debts, which were substantial. The top-up of £1.2 million didn't last half as long, as the war increased the price of naval supplies and interest on loans skyrocketed. But country MPs didn't believe any of that, and Parliament demanded to know what had happened to their money. Which profiteering courtier or corrupt official did they need to impeach and search the pockets of? 3 bodies were created to get to the root of it: the Parliamentary Committee on Miscarriages, the Public Accounts Committee, and the Brooke House Commission. Samuel Pepys was the chief defender of the Navy Board, and for all his faults, he knew his stuff. Pepys was the youngest member of the Navy Board, only in his 30s. He had no title or estates or particular social standing, but he had brains, and he came with receipts. Of course, there was some corruption, these were government officials, but Pepys gracefully kept the commissioners away from the dodgy books. In the end, Pepys was able to show that the vast majority of the money allocated to the Navy had been spent appropriately. Prices, inflation, and the simple cost of war accounted for nearly all of it. The other big scandal was the division of the fleet before the 4 days' battle. To the armchair admirals hearing about the splitting off of a squadron under Prince Rupert just days before a close-run defeat, this was clearly stupidity and incompetence of the highest order. The Committee on Miscarriages spent 4 months grilling dozens of officers and Navy Board officials, and it was a very embarrassing moment for the government. Little details, small mistakes, or minor acts of cowardice were pored over in a way they hadn't been before. But when the committee came to the question of the division of the fleet, particularly who had given the order, everyone kept quiet. The Duke of Albemarle and Prince Rupert were ascendant, despite the defeat, and the committee merely asked them to write a report on what they thought had gone wrong with the war. They graciously did so, and in these accounts they threw everyone else under the bus, especially when it came to the raid on the Medway. Albemarle's chosen scapegoat was Peter Pett, commissioner of the Chatham Dockyard, who he blamed for everything. But on the decisions taken before the 4 days' battle, both Rupert and Albemarle had little to say. Rupert said he'd sailed only reluctantly, only after being ordered to, when he'd actually been excited to have an independent command and pushed for more ships to be sent with him. Albemarle lied, telling the committee he'd been told the Dutch fleet was out of action for another month at least, and it was only because of this faulty intelligence, from someone else he might add, that he agreed to follow the order. The committee pressed. Who gave the order? Both men claimed they didn't remember. Everyone below them said the same. So the committee broke new ground and ordered the Secretaries of State to submit their personal papers. Arlington finally did so, only after getting permission from the king, and after removing anything remotely incriminating or useful. Finally, the committee presented its report, and the House of Commons voted to accept it. The division of the fleet was officially a miscarriage, a mistake. But the report didn't identify who had given the order. Debate then raged in the Commons, and it was even floated that the Privy Council should be interrogated. But cooler heads prevailed, because the stubborn silence suggested something. All these officers, officials, and courtiers were divided by faction and politics and personality. On everything else they'd criticised and named names, but not on this. Who, would all these people agree, had to be protected from embarrassment? It could be one of 2 people, James, Duke of York and Lord High Admiral, or King Charles himself. No one wanted to open that particular can of worms, so Parliament begrudgingly accepted the scapegoats which the government had provided. Commissioner Pett was one of them, briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London, and dismissed from his post. Parliament did not find the rampant corruption and gross incompetence they'd expected to find, but these investigations set an important precedent. Military strategy and the political decisions which guided it had now been scrutinised by Parliament. MPs had stopped short of directly criticising the king, but in these debates and committees, Parliament had claimed jurisdiction they hadn't held since the Civil War. And the king had not challenged these claims, conscious of his weakened political position. He'd kept guardrails, much like his grandfather James had done. But this was a very different time. Parliament was also much more open about using the power of the purse to pressure royal policy. Whereas the early Stuart parliaments had tried to hold royal ministers to account, the exact relationship between the Crown and Parliament was now blurry. The next stage of English government is now upon us, as we enter the era of the Cabal. I've written that word with capital letters in my script, Cabal. Not just to remind me to say it ominously, but because the word itself is actually initials of its members, C-A-B-A-L. Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley, and Lauderdale. These were the 5 men who had, some more than others, orchestrated the fall of Clarendon, and who now exercised powerful influence over the king. They were not equally influential at all times. At this point, Arlington was probably the most powerful, being Secretary of State and responsible for foreign affairs, but even he had limits. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was perhaps the closest, personally, to Charles. They'd grown up together, and consciously tried to emulate their father's friendship. Despite only officially being Charles's master of horse, his close relationship and regular contact with the monarch made him a powerful and disliked member of the Cabal. John Maitland, Earl of Lauderdale, Secretary of State for Scotland, was unassailable when it came to Scottish affairs. He had the king's ear due to his success. By the late 1660s, he had asserted the crown's authority throughout the northern kingdom, all from his apartments in Whitehall. Clifford and Ashley controlled the purse strings, as Treasurer and Chancellor of the Exchequer respectively. From the outside, it was this Cabal which now ruled. From the inside, it was nowhere near that neat and tidy. For starters, the Cabal didn't agree on much. They all wanted better relations with France, and most wanted greater religious toleration within England, particularly for Catholics. In this, they were of the same mind as Charles himself, which gave this agenda a boost. But besides that, they were far from united, disagreeing with each other on personal and political grounds. The Cabal acronym also excludes other powerful members of the government, who could challenge the unofficial official members of the group. But let's stay with the subject they all agreed with the king on: France. The good relations between Charles and Louis XIV had remained untouched by the small matter of war, and through secret discussions, England had approved French expansion into the Spanish Netherlands. This successfully spooked the Dutch into agreeing peace terms, although not until they'd burned down the fleet. England, the Netherlands and Sweden then agreed a triple alliance to pressure France to back off Flanders. This worked, but soon after France and Spain came to terms, friction between the 3 allies quickly grew within the Triple Alliance. But no one said diplomacy was honest. After the Peace of Breda, and throughout the Triple Alliance, the king had kept up his correspondence with Louis through his sister Henrietta, who was married to Louis's brother Philippe, Duc d'Orléans. Through this family connection, the two monarchs chatted about all sorts of things: politics, culture, the relationship between God and mankind, and the beauty of worship. You know, just the stuff you talk about with family. Encouraged by certain members of the Cabal, Charles agreed to a secret treaty with Louis in May 1670. The Treaty of Dover, which committed both France and the Stuart kingdoms into a military alliance with their shared enemy, the United Provinces of the Netherlands. They would prepare to launch this war in 2 years. Charles also promised to convert to Catholicism and announced this conversion when conditions in his kingdoms allowed. In return, Charles would receive financial subsidies from the French king to help with the preparations for war and to help reduce the power of Parliament over crown finances. Henrietta also pointed out that France and England were pretty close geographically, in case her brother needed soldiers to keep Parliament in line. Now, this treaty was obviously explosive. Not only had Charles committed to betray an ally, the Triple Alliance was still in effect, but more damningly, he swore to become a Catholic, and the alliance implied that French soldiers could be used to force his subjects back to Rome. The danger this posed to the monarchy suggests that this was about more than just getting more money from the French. Considering his later actions, this does appear to be entirely sincere. To not only put his intent in writing, but in a formal treaty with another monarch, tells us a lot about how serious Charles II was on this point. But however sincere he was, Charles wasn't stupid. He knew full well that if this clause became public knowledge, only a decade after his family was restored to the throne, he'd face massive opposition, if not rebellion and another civil war. So this treaty was kept secret from everyone. The only people who knew were Charles and Louis, Henrietta, and Clifford and Arlington from the Cabal. The rest of the government, including B, L, and the other A of the Cabal, were kept in the dark. Lauderdale especially. As a devout Presbyterian, he'd have hit the roof. But there still needed to be a treaty to act as cover. So Charles sent the Duke of Buckingham to Paris to smooth over any ruffled feathers between England and France from the recent diplomatic crisis. Buckingham turned up and found that the French were extremely willing to set all their grievances aside. Before he knew it, a draft of a quote-unquote new treaty was presented and signed. This should have been far more difficult to hash out, but Buckingham took the easy win. Before the end of 1670, this treaty was signed. Most of the Privy Council had no idea that it was entirely fake. The fake treaty covered most of the same points as the real secret one, with the noted exception of Charles's intention to convert to Catholicism. A significant blow, both personally for the Stuarts and to any plans for an open reconversion, came within a month of the secret treaty being signed in June 1670. Henrietta, who had done so much to boost the idea to her brother and brother-in-law, and whose personal visit to England provided perfect cover for the secret treaty to be signed, suddenly died. She was only 26. Her death was probably caused by a burst ulcer, but contemporaries widely believed the young princess had been poisoned. Charles was absolutely devastated at the death of his youngest sister, and though the treaty would remain in force, the cause of Catholicism in England had lost its greatest champion outside it. Next time, we will head over the Atlantic to check in on England's colonies. What was happening in New England? How are things going on in the Old Dominion of Virginia? And why are there pirates in the Caribbean? Before we finish up, I'm excited to announce that I'll be speaking at this year's Intelligent Speech, the online podcast conference. This year's theme is Companions and Rivals, and I'm on a panel discussing paramours and lovers. With subjects like Charles II, how could I not? Throughout the day, there will be 4 rooms running different sessions, with time for Q&A and audience interaction. Some of the other podcasts attending are the History of Byzantium, History of Persia, Totalis Rankium, Pontifex, and many other independent shows. The conference is on the 28th of February, so more or less a month from the day this episode goes out, and tickets are $30, unless you use the discount code PAX, that's PAX, to get 10% off. Go to intelligentspeechonline.com to find out more and buy your tickets, and I hope to see you there. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Brooke Chappell of the Earldom of Gwynedd. They have joined my existing supporters, including the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Jarrow Kotowski, Damien, Duke of Portland, Brandon Stansbury, Marquis of Montague, and Tabitha Aberts, Countess of Sandringham. Thank you to all of my patrons who have received this episode and every other episode ad-free. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica for more information. Thanks also to everyone who has left reviews on Apple Podcasts and comments on Spotify. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music used in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.